The blood-soaked bandana dropped from Penelope Shaw's trembling fingers as she collapsed against the half-built cabin wall, exhaustion threatening to claim her like it had claimed her father just 3 days prior. The Montana Territory of 1878 was unforgiving to those who came unprepared, and even more so to a woman alone. She wiped the sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of dirt across her freckled face as she stared at the unfinished walls of what was supposed to be their new beginning. "Pa, I don't know if I can finish what we started," she whispered to the wind that whistled through the pine trees surrounding her small clearing. The plot of land, nestled in a valley 20 miles from the nearest settlement of Helena, had been her father's dream. Now it was her burden. Penelope gathered her strength and reached for another log. At 22, she'd never imagined she'd be building a cabin alone. Back in St. Louis, she'd been a schoolteacher with soft hands and a heart full of adventure. Now those hands were calloused, her fingernails cracked and filled with dirt. The log was heavier than she anticipated. As she struggled to lift it into place, her foot slipped on the muddy ground. She let out a cry as both she and the log tumbled down. Pain shot through her ankle and tears sprang to her eyes. "Damn it all," she muttered, pounding her fist against the earth. "Madam, you all right over there?" Penelope's head whipped up at the unfamiliar voice. Approaching on horseback was a tall figure, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. Her hand instinctively moved toward the rifle propped against the wall several feet away. "That's far enough," she called out, trying to mask the pain in her voice. The rider slowed his horse to a stop and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "Just passing through and heard what sounded like trouble." As he moved closer, Penelope could make out his features. The man was perhaps 30, with a weathered face that had seen its share of sun and hardship. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but well maintained. A cowboy by the look of his attire and the way he sat his horse. "I'm fine," she insisted, attempting to stand but wincing as her weight shifted to her injured ankle. The man dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. "Name's Ethan Wilcox," he said, tipping his hat. "And begging your pardon, madam, but you don't look fine to me." Penelope straightened her shoulders, painfully aware of her disheveled appearance. "Penelope Shaw, and I'm managing just fine on my own, Mr. Wilcox." His eyes took in the half-built cabin, the scattered tools, and the fresh grave marked with a wooden cross just visible on a small rise behind the clearing. Understanding flickered across his face. "You building this place all by yourself?" "I am now," she replied, her voice tight with pride and grief. Ethan nodded slowly, taking in the situation. Then he looked at the wall she'd been working on, walked over to examine it, and ran a hand along the rough-hewn logs. "Some walls are better raised together, Miss Shaw," he said quietly. Penelope's throat tightened at his words. For 3 days, she'd held herself together by sheer force of will. For 3 days, she'd refused to acknowledge the impossibility of her task. Now, hearing the simple truth spoken aloud nearly broke her. "I don't need charity," she managed. "Never said you did." Ethan gazed at the unfinished cabin. "But winter's coming and a roof over your head isn't charity, it's necessity." He removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair. "I've got experience with cabin raising. I could lend a hand for a few days, get you weather tight before the cold sets in." "And what would you want in return, Mr. Wilcox?" Penelope asked warily, having learned that men rarely offered help without expecting something in return. "A hot meal when you've got it to spare would be payment enough." He looked toward the grave. "And the story of who's resting over there, if you're willing to tell it." Penelope studied him carefully. There was something in his eyes, a quiet understanding, perhaps even a shared pain that made her hesitate to send him away. "My father," she finally said. "Fever took him 3 nights ago." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Shaw." The sincerity in his voice loosened something tight in her chest. Penelope glanced at the sky, noting the position of the sun. It would be dark in a few hours, and she'd made little progress today. "I suppose I could use some help with the roof," she conceded reluctantly. "Just until it's weather tight." The ghost of a smile crossed Ethan's face. "Then we'd best get started." He removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and picked up the log she dropped. "Where were you planning to place this one?" By the time darkness fell, they had added 3 more logs to the wall. Ethan worked efficiently, showing Penelope how to notch the ends properly to create a stronger joint. He said little, asking only practical questions about her plans for the cabin. Penelope prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork over the campfire. As they ate, she found herself studying her unexpected helper. His hands were strong and capable, his movements deliberate. He wasn't like the boisterous cowboys she'd encountered in town, full of bravado and tall tales. There was a quietness to him that suggested depth. "Where are you headed?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Nowhere in particular," Ethan replied, staring into the flames. "Been working cattle drives up from Texas for a spell. Thought I might winter in Montana this year, see if there's work to be had. Not many ranches hiring this late in the season." "No, I suppose not." He set his empty plate aside. "How about you, Miss Shaw? What brings a woman alone to stake a claim in these parts?" Penelope looked toward her father's grave. "It wasn't supposed to be just me. Pa and I left St. Louis 3 months ago. He had maps, plans, dreams of raising horses in Montana territory. Horse breeding is good business if you know what you're doing. Pa did. He worked with horses all his life." Penelope swallowed hard. The fever hit him fast. One day he was felling trees, the next he couldn't stand. By the third day he was gone. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "You could have gone back east. And do what? Teach children their letters until I'm gray and forgotten." She shook her head. "Pa left me this land, his dream. I aim to see it through. That takes courage or foolishness," she replied with a bitter smile. "The neighbors back home certainly thought so. A woman has no business homesteading alone, they said." Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. "I've known men who'd run at the first sign of trouble. Yet here you are, building a cabin by yourself after burying your father. I'd call that courage." Warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through Penelope's chest at his words. She busied herself with cleaning the dishes to hide her reaction. "There's a creek just beyond those trees," she said, changing the subject. "You're welcome to water your horse and set up your bedroll by the fire. Much obliged." As Ethan led his horse away, Penelope retreated to her own small tent. Her ankle throbbed, but she was too proud to mention it. Tomorrow would be another day of work, and she couldn't afford to show weakness. She listened to the sounds of the night settling around her, the crackle of the fire, the occasional snort from Ethan's horse, the distant howl of a coyote. For the first time since her father died, she didn't feel completely alone. Morning arrived with a chill that hinted at the coming winter. Penelope awoke to the smell of coffee brewing. She emerged from her tent to find Ethan already at work, splitting logs with efficient strokes of the axe. "Hope you don't mind," he said, nodding toward the coffee pot balanced on stones at the edge of the fire. "Thought we could use an early start." "Not at all." Penelope poured herself a cup, grateful for the warmth. Her ankle felt better, though still tender. "You're handy with that axe. Spent a winter in a logging camp in Oregon once." He split another log cleanly. "Learned a few things." They worked together throughout the day, falling into a rhythm. Ethan showed Penelope how to use leverage instead of strength to move the heavy logs. By midday, the walls were taking shape, standing chest high around the perimeter. "You've thought this through," Ethan commented as he examined her plans for the cabin. "This is a solid design." "Pa drew it up," Penelope said. "He wanted a proper home, not just a shelter. He had good instincts." Ethan pointed to a section of the drawing. "Though you might want to consider enlarging this window. Would give you more light in winter months." As the days passed, the cabin walls grew higher. Penelope found herself watching Ethan when he wasn't looking, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt as he worked, the concentration in his eyes as he measured and cut. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful and his rare smiles transformed his serious face. On the fourth day, a problem arose with the chimney stones. Penelope struggled to fit them together properly, growing increasingly frustrated. "Here like this," Ethan said, coming to her side. His hands covered hers as he guided the placement of the stone. The unexpected contact sent a jolt through Penelope that had nothing to do with the physical labor. She pulled away quickly. "I can manage." Something flashed in Ethan's eyes, hurt, perhaps before he stepped back. "Of course." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Penelope broke their unspoken rule of keeping conversations practical. "You never said where you're from originally." Ethan looked up from the piece of wood he was whittling. All over, I suppose. Born in Pennsylvania, father was a restless sort, and your mother died when I was young. His knife paused. My father blamed himself, took to drinking, then to wandering, dragged me along until I was old enough to make my own way. I'm sorry, Penelope said softly. Ethan shrugged. It was a long time ago. Is that why you keep moving? Because of your father? The question seemed to surprise him. He considered it for a moment. Maybe never thought of it that way. He set aside his whittling. What about you? You mentioned teaching back in St. Louis. For 3 years at a small school, I enjoyed it, but Penelope stared into the flames. It wasn't enough. I watched other women my age marry, have children, settle into lives that seemed to shrink smaller each year. She looked up at him. I wanted something more. So you came west with your father. People thought I was mad. A spinster school teacher abandoning security for the unknown. She smiled ruefully. Perhaps they were right. I don't think so, Ethan said quietly. There's nothing wrong with wanting a bigger life. Their eyes met across the fire, and Penelope felt a connection forming between them, fragile as spider silk, but just as real. For a moment, neither spoke. The moment was broken by a distant roll of thunder. Ethan looked up at the sky, which had darkened ominously while they talked. Storm's coming, he said. We'd best secure what we can. They worked quickly, covering tools and supplies with canvas. The wind picked up, bending the tall pines surrounding the clearing. Fat raindrops began to fall as they finished. Get to your tent, Ethan called over the rising wind. I'll make sure the fire's out. Penelope had barely reached her tent when the sky opened up. Rain pounded the canvas and lightning flashed across the sky. She huddled inside, listening to the storm rage around her. A sudden gust ripped at her tent, pulling stakes from the ground. Canvas flapped wildly as rain poured in. Penelope struggled to hold the tent in place, but another powerful gust tore it from her grasp. Penelope, Ethan's voice called through the downpour. He appeared through the curtain of rain, soaked to the skin. Come on, he shouted, taking her arm. The cabin walls will give us some shelter. They ran to the half-built cabin. Without a roof, it offered imperfect protection, but the walls blocked the worst of the wind and some of the rain. They huddled in a corner where 2 walls met at their highest point. Penelope shivered in her wet clothes. Without thinking, Ethan put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side for warmth. Sorry, she stammered through chattering teeth. For what? Not controlling the weather. There was a hint of humor in his voice. For this mess. You should never have stopped to help a stubborn woman with more determination than sense. I'm exactly where I want to be, Penelope. The use of her first name caught her attention. In the dim light, with rain streaming down his face, Ethan looked at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Why did you really stop? She asked. The truth, Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. I saw the fresh grave, he finally said. Reminded me of digging my own father's grave 5 years back, middle of nowhere, no one to help. His voice grew softer. I couldn't just ride past. Penelope placed her hand over his. I'm glad you didn't. The storm continued through the night. They talked in hushed voices, sharing stories from their pasts as the hours stretched on. Ethan told her about his years working cattle, about the beauty of Texas hill country and the vastness of the Oklahoma plains. Penelope spoke of her students, of her mother who had died when she was 16, of her dreams of a life not confined by society's expectations. By the time dawn broke, the rain had stopped. They emerged from their shelter, stiff and exhausted, but somehow changed. The clearing was a muddy mess. Penelope's tent lay in tatters several yards away, and supplies were scattered across the ground. Well, she said, surveying the damage, this is a fine way to start the day. Ethan chuckled, and soon Penelope joined him. Their laughter echoed through the clearing, a release of tension after the long night. I suppose we should prioritize that roof now, Ethan said once they'd recovered. I suppose we should, Penelope agreed. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked with renewed determination. The cabin walls rose to their full height, and the roof began to take shape. Ethan fashioned a door from split logs, complete with leather hinges and a wooden latch. Penelope couldn't help but notice that he'd stopped talking about moving on. Each evening by the fire, they grew more comfortable with each other. She learned that he had a quiet sense of humor, a talent for whittling, and strong opinions about the proper way to make cornbread. He discovered her love of reading, her skill with numbers, and her surprising knowledge of horse breeding gleaned from years of listening to her father. One afternoon, as they worked side by side on the roof beams, Penelope noticed Ethan watching her with an intensity that made her flush. "What is it?" she asked. "Do I have something on my face?" "No," he said softly. "I was just thinking that I've never met anyone quite like you, Penelope Shaw." The simple statement, delivered with such honesty, made her heart race. "Is that good or bad?" she asked, aiming for lightness but hearing the vulnerability in her own voice. "Definitely good," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. That night, Ethan mentioned riding to Helena the next day for supplies. "We're running low on nails and winter's coming fast. I thought I might see about getting some glass for your windows while I'm there." "Our windows," Penelope corrected before she could stop herself. Ethan looked up sharply. "What?" Penelope took a deep breath. Over the past weeks, she'd come to a realization that both frightened and exhilarated her. "Ethan, I've been thinking, this land has plenty of room for horses. My father left detailed notes on breeding and training." She twisted her hands nervously. "What I don't have is experience with the animals themselves. But you do." "Penelope, what are you saying?" "I'm proposing a partnership." She met his gaze steadily. "You stay, help me establish the horse farm, we split the profits. This cabin would be yours as much as mine." Something like disappointment flickered across his face. "A business partnership." "For now," she added quietly, unless you wanted something more." The silence that followed seemed endless. Ethan set aside the cup he was holding and moved to sit beside her on the log they used as a bench. "Penelope," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "when I found you building this cabin alone, I admired your courage. As I've come to know you, that admiration has grown into something much deeper." He took her hand in his. "I don't want a business partnership, I want to court you properly, if you'll allow it." Relief and joy washed over Penelope. "I'd like that very much." His smile was like the sunrise, transforming his entire face. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, Ethan leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, a question more than a demand. Penelope answered by sliding her hand up to his shoulder and leaning into the kiss. When they finally parted, they were both breathless. "I'll still need to go to Helena tomorrow," Ethan said, his voice husky. "But I promise I'll come back." "I know you will," Penelope replied, certain of it in a way she'd never been certain of anything before. The next morning, Penelope watched Ethan ride out, his figure growing smaller against the vast Montana sky. For the first time since her father's death, she felt hopeful about the future. She turned back to the nearly completed cabin, running her hand along the solid walls they'd built together. "You were right, Pa," she said softly. "This is where I belong." Ethan returned from Helena 3 days later with a wagon loaded with supplies. Along with nails, glass, and provisions, he'd brought a rocking chair, fabric for curtains, and a small collection of books. "A proper home needs proper furnishings," he explained when Penelope protested the expense. The following weeks were filled with work and quiet moments of growing closeness. They finished the cabin just as the first snow dusted the mountains. The single room was small but snug, with a stone fireplace, 2 windows with real glass, and solid walls to keep out the winter winds. As propriety demanded, Ethan built himself a small lean-to shelter near the barn they'd begun constructing for the future horses. Though he no longer slept by the fire outside her tent, they spent their evenings together in the cabin, planning for the spring and the horses they would acquire. Their first kiss had been followed by others, each one deepening the connection between them. Ethan was respectful, never presuming more than Penelope was ready to give, but his eyes often followed her with a heat that made her skin tingle. One evening in early December, as snow fell softly outside, Ethan took Penelope's hand across the table they'd built together. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his expression serious. Fear clutched at Penelope's heart. "You're leaving?" "No," he said quickly, "just the opposite." He squeezed her hand. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, no purpose, no place to call home." His eyes held hers. "You've changed that. You've changed me." "Ethan, please let me finish. I know it's only been a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Penelope Shaw. I want to build a life with you right here, if you'll have me." Tears filled Penelope's eyes. I love you too, she whispered. Ethan stood and pulled her to her feet, gathering her into his arms. His kiss was tender at first, then increasingly passionate as she responded eagerly. Marry me, he murmured against her lips. Be my wife. Yes, Penelope answered without hesitation. Yes, with the nearest preacher in Helena, they decided to wait until spring for a proper wedding. The winter months passed in a blur of preparation for their future. Together, they finished the small barn, built corrals, and planned which breeding stock to purchase when the snow melted. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes reading aloud from Penelope's books, sometimes simply talking. Ethan told her about his dream of breeding quarter horses, sturdy animals well-suited to ranch work. Penelope shared her hopes of perhaps starting a small school for the children of nearby homesteaders once their horse business was established. You'd be a wonderful teacher, Ethan said, watching her face animated with excitement. Our children would be lucky to have you as their mother. The mention of children brought a blush to Penelope's cheeks, but also a warm glow of anticipation. A family of her own, it was something she'd given up hope for back in St. Louis, where eligible men had shown little interest in a plain-spoken, independent-minded schoolteacher. Our children, she repeated softly. I like the sound of that. The first thaw came in late March. As the snow receded, Ethan and Penelope began the long-delayed journey to Helena for their wedding. They traveled in the wagon Ethan had purchased during the winter, loaded with furs and handcrafted items to sell in town. Helena in 1879 was a bustling mining town, its streets filled with a mix of fortune seekers, settlers, and merchants. After months of solitude at their homestead, Penelope found the noise and activity overwhelming at first. They stayed at a small boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Holloway, who clucked disapprovingly at their unmarried state, but softened when Penelope explained they had come specifically to rectify that situation. The preacher does his services on Sundays, Mrs. Holloway informed them. You'll have to wait 3 days. Those 3 days were filled with preparations. Ethan sold their furs for a good price and used part of the money to buy Penelope a proper wedding dress, nothing fancy, but a pretty blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. Penelope, meanwhile, purchased a new shirt and string tie for Ethan, insisting he couldn't get married in his work clothes. On Sunday morning, they stood before Reverend Thomas in the small church at the edge of town. Mrs. Holloway and a few other boarding house residents served as witnesses. Do you, Ethan James Wilcox, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The Reverend asked. I do, Ethan replied, his voice steady and sure. And do you, Penelope Ann Shaw, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Penelope said, smiling through happy tears. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Ethan's kiss was gentle but filled with promise. As they turned to face the small congregation, Penelope felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was the beginning of their life together, a life she had never imagined possible when she'd stood alone beside her half-built cabin less than a year ago. That night, in a small room at the boarding house, they came together as husband and wife. Ethan's touch was gentle, his patience infinite as he guided Penelope through her first experience of physical love. What began as awkwardness soon transformed into a passionate connection that left them both breathless and amazed. I never knew it could be like this, Penelope whispered later, her head resting on Ethan's chest. He stroked her hair, his other arm holding her close against his side. Neither did I, he admitted. You're a revelation, Penelope Wilcox. She smiled at her new name. Say it again. Penelope Wilcox, he obliged, pressing a kiss to her forehead. My wife. They spent a week in Helena, purchasing supplies and the first of their breeding stock, 3 mares in foal and a young stallion with impressive bloodlines. The journey back to their homestead took 3 days, with frequent stops to rest the horses. When the cabin came into view, Penelope felt a surge of emotion. It looks different somehow, she observed. It's home now, Ethan said simply. Our home. Spring brought new life to the valley. The mares delivered healthy foals. The garden Penelope planted began to flourish, and their small herd grew with the purchase of 2 more mares from a rancher 40 miles to the south. As summer approached, Penelope made an important discovery. The morning sickness came first, followed by the realization that her monthly cycle had not arrived for 2 months. She waited until evening to tell Ethan, when they sat together on the porch he'd added to the cabin. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, a fitting backdrop for her news. "Ethan," she began, her hand finding his, "I'm with child." His head whipped around, eyes wide with wonder. "A baby, you're sure?" Penelope nodded, smiling at his expression. "Pretty sure. It will be winter by the time he or she arrives." Ethan let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby corral. He lifted Penelope from her chair and spun her around, then set her down quickly. "Should I not do that? Will it hurt the baby?" he asked anxiously. Penelope laughed. "The baby is fine. I'm not made of glass, Ethan." He knelt before her chair and placed his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "A child," he whispered, "our child." The months that followed were busy ones. Ethan, concerned about Penelope's condition, took on more of the physical labor around the homestead. Penelope, for her part, divided her time between caring for the horses, keeping their accounts in order, and preparing for the baby. Word of their horse farm had begun to spread. A rancher from the next valley purchased one of their yearlings, praising the animal's conformation and temperament. 2 more buyers came before summer's end, each leaving with horses and promises to recommend Wilcox horses to others looking for quality stock. As Penelope's belly grew, so did their business prospects. Ethan built in addition to the cabin a separate bedroom and a larger kitchen. They hired a local boy, the son of a neighboring homesteader, to help with the daily chores. Autumn arrived with its golden light and crisp mornings. Penelope, now heavy with child, spent more time indoors preparing for the winter ahead. She sewed tiny garments from fabric purchased in Helena, and Ethan crafted a cradle from pine wood, carving intricate patterns along its edges. "What shall we name the baby?" Penelope asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her feet propped on a stool Ethan had placed for her. "If it's a boy, perhaps after your father," Ethan suggested. "What was his name?" "Samuel," Penelope replied, touched by the gesture. "Samuel Wilcox has a good sound to it, and if it's a girl." Penelope considered. "I've always been fond of the name Elizabeth, after my mother." "Samuel or Elizabeth," Ethan mused, his hand resting on Penelope's rounded belly. "Either way, this child will be loved." The baby arrived during the first snowfall of winter. Penelope's labor began in the early morning hours, waking her from a sound sleep. She nudged Ethan awake. "It's time," she said, wincing as another contraction tightened around her midsection. Ethan was instantly alert. They had prepared for this moment, knowing the nearest doctor was too far to reach in time. Mrs. Larson, a neighbor with experience as a midwife, had agreed to come when Penelope's time arrived. "I'll fetch Mrs. Larson," Ethan said, already pulling on his clothes. "Be careful," Penelope cautioned. "The snow, don't worry about me," he kissed her forehead. "Just focus on yourself and the baby. I'll be back as soon as I can." The hours that followed were a blur of pain and determination for Penelope. Mrs. Larson arrived with Ethan just as the contractions were intensifying. She shooed Ethan from the bedroom with instructions to boil water and prepare clean linens. "Men are useless in a birthing room," she declared, rolling up her sleeves. "Now then, Penelope, let's bring this baby into the world." The labor was long and difficult. Outside the bedroom door, Ethan paced, his face drawn with worry every time he heard Penelope cry out. Mrs. Larson occasionally emerged to request more hot water or clean cloths, her expression giving nothing away. As the winter afternoon waned toward evening, a new sound filled the cabin, the lusty cry of a newborn baby. Ethan froze in his pacing, his heart pounding as he waited for Mrs. Larson to call him in. The door opened, and the midwife appeared, her stern face softened by a rare smile. "You have a son, Mr. Wilcox, a fine, healthy boy." Ethan entered the bedroom on unsteady legs. Penelope lay propped against pillows, her face pale but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as Ethan approached, her smile tired but triumphant. "Meet your son, Samuel Ethan Wilcox," she said softly. Ethan sat carefully on the edge of the bed and gazed in wonder at the tiny, red-faced infant. Samuel had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were the deep blue of all newborns. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch his son's cheek. "You're both perfect. Mrs. Larson stayed the night, showing Penelope how to nurse the baby and checking frequently to ensure both mother and child were doing well. By morning, Penelope was sitting up in bed, tired but content, while Samuel slept peacefully in his new cradle. "You did good work, both of you," Mrs. Larson pronounced as she prepared to leave. "That boy will grow strong here." The first weeks of Samuel's life coincided with one of the harshest winters in memory. Snow piled high around the cabin and bitter winds howled through the valley. Inside, however, the Wilcox family created their own warmth. Ethan proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to bring Samuel to Penelope for feedings, changing cloths without complaint, and spending hours simply holding his son while Penelope rested. During the day, he tended to the horses and maintained the homestead, ensuring their small family remained safe and provided for despite the brutal weather. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Samuel grew stronger. His newborn fussiness eased, replaced by a sunny disposition that delighted both parents. He had Penelope's blue eyes and Ethan's dark hair, a perfect blend of them both. With the thaw came renewed activity at Wilcox Horses. The foaling season brought 5 new additions to their herd, all healthy and showing promise. Word of their quality stock had spread, and buyers began arriving as soon as the roads were passable. One afternoon in late spring, as Penelope sat on the porch with Samuel in her arms, watching Ethan work with a young colt in the corral, a realization struck her. This life so different from anything she had imagined back in St. Louis was everything she had ever wanted without knowing it. "Look, Samuel," she murmured to her son, "that's your father. He's teaching that horse patience and trust." She kissed the top of the baby's head, "just as he taught me." That evening, after Samuel was asleep in his cradle, Penelope and Ethan sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "I was thinking," Ethan said, his arm around Penelope's shoulders, "that we might want to expand the corral come summer." "We're outgrowing the space we have," Penelope agreed. "And perhaps another room for the cabin in a year or two. Samuel won't always be content in our bedroom." Ethan looked at her with a raised eyebrow. "Planning for more children already," Penelope smiled. "Perhaps." "Would that be so terrible?" "Not terrible at all," he replied, pulling her closer. "In fact, I'd like nothing better than to fill this valley with little Wilcoxes." "Not too many," Penelope cautioned with a laugh. "I'd like some time to help with the horses between babies." Ethan's expression grew serious. "Are you happy here, Penelope? Truly happy?" She turned to face him, taking his face between her hands. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she kissed him softly. "When my father died and I stood alone beside our half-built cabin, I thought my life was ending. I couldn't imagine how I would survive, let alone find joy again. And then I came along and annoyed you with my unsolicited advice about wall raising," Ethan teased. "You didn't annoy me," Penelope corrected. "You scared me." "Scared you? How?" "Because from the moment you said some walls are better raised together, something inside me recognized you." She traced the line of his jaw with her finger. "As if my heart had been waiting for you all along." Ethan caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I felt it too." "Why do you think I stayed? I had no plans, nowhere to be, but suddenly I couldn't imagine being anywhere but here. With you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the valley, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the pines. "We should check on Samuel," Penelope said eventually. Hand in hand, they went inside to look at their sleeping son. In the soft glow of the lamplight, his tiny face was peaceful, his chest rising and falling with each breath. "We made this," Ethan whispered in wonder. "A life, a family." Penelope leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his body supporting hers. "Together," she agreed, "the way all the best things are made." As the years passed, Wilcox Horses flourished. Ethan's skill with breeding and training, combined with Penelope's sharp business sense, created a reputation that spread throughout the Montana Territory and beyond. Their stock became known for intelligence, stamina, and even temperament qualities increasingly valued as the West continued to develop. Samuel grew into a sturdy boy with his father's quiet confidence and his mother's curious mind. When he was 4, a sister joined the family. Elizabeth Ann Wilcox arrived in the summer of 1883, a delicate girl with fair hair who nevertheless possessed a determination that matched her mother's. By 1885, the original cabin had been expanded to a comfortable home with 4 rooms, a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and a root cellar for storing food through the winter. The barn had grown as well, now housing 12 stalls for their most valuable breeding stock. Additional corrals and pastures spread across the valley, filled with horses in various stages of training. They hired 2 full-time hands to help with the daily work, and Ethan built a bunkhouse to provide them with comfortable quarters. One of the hands, a young man named Patrick, showed particular promise with the horses. Ethan took him under his wing, teaching him the finer points of training. "He reminds me of myself at that age," Ethan told Penelope one evening, "eager to learn, good with the animals." "Except you were a drifter and Patrick has put down roots," Penelope pointed out as she mended one of Samuel's shirts. "He talks about saving for his own place someday. The West is changing," Ethan observed. "When I was riding the trails, a man could go for days without seeing another soul. Now there are homesteads and ranches spreading across the territory. Do you miss it? The freedom of those days?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "I miss the beauty of the open country sometimes, the solitude, but no, I don't miss the life." He looked around their comfortable home, at Samuel playing with carved wooden horses on the floor, at Elizabeth sleeping in her cradle. "This is worth more than all the freedom in the world." As promised years earlier, Penelope started a small school when Samuel reached learning age. At first, it was just for their own children and those of their nearest neighbors, held 3 days a week in the front room of their home. But as more families settled in the valley, the need for education grew. In 1887, the community came together to build a proper schoolhouse on the edge of the Wilcox property. It was a simple 1-room building, but it had real desks, a blackboard, and shelves of books that Penelope ordered from as far away as Chicago. Mrs. Wilcox's school, as it came to be known, gained a reputation for excellence that matched Wilcox horses. Penelope's methods were progressive for the time. She believed in encouraging curiosity and critical thinking rather than rote memorization alone. "Children need to understand why things work as they do," she explained to parents who sometimes questioned her approach. "Knowing what is only half of learning." By 1890, with Samuel 11 and Elizabeth 7, Penelope made another joyful discovery. At 34, she was expecting their 3rd child. "Are you sure you're not too tired for this?" Ethan asked worriedly when she told him the news. At 42, his hair was beginning to show strands of silver at the temples, though he remained as strong and capable as ever. "I'm perfectly healthy," Penelope assured him, "and very happy." The pregnancy progressed smoothly until early winter when Penelope developed a troubling cough. The doctor from Helena, summoned by a concerned Ethan, prescribed bed rest and close monitoring. "The baby is fine," he told them. "But Mrs. Wilcox needs to conserve her strength. No teaching, no household duties, no exertion of any kind until that cough clears." It was a difficult time for the family. Ethan divided his attention between the horse business, the children, and caring for Penelope. Samuel, old enough to understand the seriousness of the situation, took on extra responsibilities without complaint. Elizabeth appointed herself her mother's special helper, bringing cups of tea and reading aloud from Penelope's favorite books. The community rallied around them as well. The women took turns cooking meals and helping with household chores. The men ensured the Wilcox horses received proper care, following Ethan's instructions to the letter. Gradually, Penelope's health improved. By spring, she was well enough to move about the house, though still cautious. The doctor, making one of his regular visits, pronounced himself satisfied with her progress. "The danger has passed," he told Ethan. "Both mother and child should come through just fine now." In April of 1891, Penelope gave birth to their 2nd son. James Samuel Wilcox entered the world with a lusty cry that his parents declared was the most beautiful sound they'd ever heard. "He's got your lungs," Ethan teased as Penelope nursed the newborn. "And your stubbornness," she retorted. "Did you see how he fought the doctor when he was being cleaned up?" As James grew from infant to toddler, it became clear that he had inherited traits from both parents in abundance. He was curious like his mother, but had his father's quiet way of observing before acting. His older siblings adored him, and he followed them everywhere once he learned to walk. The 1890s brought changes to Montana as it transitioned from territory to state. Helena, the capital city, grew rapidly. New settlers arrived by train, and the landscape of isolated homesteads gradually gave way to more established communities. Wilcox horses adapted with the times. Ethan, always forward-thinking, recognized that the demand for working horses would eventually decrease as machinery became more prevalent. He began focusing their breeding program on horses suited for other purposes: cavalry mounts for the army, carriage horses for wealthy urban dwellers, and riding horses for the growing leisure class. Penelope, meanwhile, expanded her educational efforts. In addition to the day school for children, she began offering evening classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading and mathematics skills. Many of these were immigrants who had arrived with limited formal education, but abundant determination. "Learning doesn't stop when childhood ends," she told Ethan when he expressed concern about her taking on too much. "Besides, I enjoy it. Teaching has always been part of who I am." As the century drew to a close, the Wilcox family celebrated 20 years in their valley. The original cabin, now serving as a tack room beside the main barn, stood as a reminder of how far they had come. "It's hard to believe I once thought I could build that myself," Penelope remarked as she and Ethan walked through the property one autumn afternoon. Their youngest, James, ran ahead of them, chasing fallen leaves that skittered across the ground in the breeze. "You could have," Ethan said with confidence. "You're the most capable woman I've ever known." "Perhaps," Penelope acknowledged, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. 20 years had added lines to his face and silver to his hair, but his eyes still held the same warmth when he looked at her. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Letting a dusty cowboy help with your walls?" Penelope reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar contours. "Not for a single moment. Even when I'm being stubborn about how to train the new colts, or arguing with Samuel about whether he's ready to take on more responsibility with the business." "Especially then," Penelope said with a smile, "because that's when I remember what you taught me all those years ago, that the most important things in life are better when they're built together." Ethan pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I love you, Penelope Wilcox. More now than the day I married you." "And I love you," she replied, "my wandering cowboy who finally found home." James circled back to them, his small face flushed with excitement. "Mama, Papa, come see, there's a nest in the old oak tree." Hand in hand, Ethan and Penelope followed their son, their steps perfectly matched after years of walking life's path together. Behind them stood the home and business they had built from nothing. Before them stretched a future filled with the promise of continued growth and change. As they reached the oak tree and lifted James up to see the abandoned bird's nest, Penelope caught Ethan's eye over their son's dark head. No words were needed between them, just the shared knowledge that every wall they had raised together had created not just a home, but a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. In the spring of 1900, as a new century dawned, the Wilcox family gathered on the porch of their home to watch a spectacular sunset paint the Montana sky. Samuel, now 21, stood tall beside his father, discussing plans for expanding their horse breeding operation further east. Elizabeth, 18 and recently graduated from Penelope's school, sat in a rocking chair with a book of poetry in her lap. 9-year-old James played with the family's aging dog at the edge of the porch steps. Penelope, her hand resting comfortably in Ethan's, looked out over the valley that had become their kingdom. What had once been an isolated clearing in the wilderness was now the heart of a thriving community. The school she had founded now employed 3 teachers. Wilcox Horses was known throughout the western states for quality and reliability. Their children were growing into capable, compassionate adults with dreams of their own. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, his voice low and intimate despite the family surrounding them. Penelope smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I'm thinking about walls," she said, "and how right you were about raising them together." Ethan squeezed her hand, understanding perfectly. "After all these years, They still spoke the language of each other's, hearts, a language that had begun with a half-built cabin and a stranger's timely words of wisdom, and had grown into a love story as vast and enduring as the Montana sky above them.